So, we were talking about national identities. In order for me to believe in a country of 40 million people that I am part of that nation, according to an idealist, I'd need to have access to a story that says that. The ability to tell a story to 40 million people that convinces all of them that they are part of the same story requires a significant amount of power. I can't do that, especially people couldn't do that for a long time without the technology we now have, and have people listen to that story regularly. Nations use a variety of ways to do this. Governments often have control over education systems and the design of education curricula, and we have the same story given about what our country is across most of the schools in the country. We might even have television news at night to remind us what the people in our country are doing or what the most important event in our country has been. This is storytelling. And storytelling is so powerful, according to idealists, it can make us arrange our lives and behave in such a way that we reenact or recreate or confirm that story that we have about ourselves. For the most part of the 20th century, the ability to do this was very expensive. To have radio stations, or to run newspapers, or to have television, all of these instruments required a lot of money. And to have a captive audience who will listen only to that story for a long period of time in the age known as the age of mass media, you had to prevent other stories from being told. Things have changed, but still there is that ability. This suggests interesting things, for instance, about the images we saw of women in advertisements. In advertisements, it has become normal for us to see women scantily dressed to sell products. Some of you might have been disturbed by the images of men posing in similar ways to maybe sell products. We are not used to seeing that. That suggests something interesting about who is able to produce images and produce narratives that become normal. And here is our drawing. So we will see from this drawing that representations, which we said we're going to talk about in terms of images and narratives, are visible, and the constant creation or constant reproduction of representations often gives us what is called normativity. What is normal, for instance, seeing a woman in a bikini posing next to a shiny motorbike, is something that is constructed and confirmed for us by the constant reproduction of these images. Most of us in our class discussions didn't even find this surprising, whether you're a girl or a boy, whether you were interested in women sexually or not. However, when we started seeing images of men posing in a similar way, there was something that was disturbing. But why was it disturbing to see a man exposing parts of his body to try to appeal to us sexually to sell a particular product? People who do critical analysis of narratives and images say that is because of something called the gaze. Every image has a visible part, that is what we normally see. But every image, they argue, has an invisible part, and that is the part of the ideal creator, spectator. This is the person who made the image and who is the person best able to consume that image as an image that makes sense. So in the image of women, many feminist scholars have argued for years that the ideal spectator and consumer is a male heterosexual person. That is, a person who is male, who enjoys looking at women for their sexual pleasure. That is why that person would produce representations, produce both images and stories that say, that give, that is why that person would produce that story, produce images and narratives for their enjoyment. It is possible for women who are not sexually interested in women to also find this to be normal, but they're not finding it normal in the same way that the ideal looker is finding it normal. So this tells us that there is something called the gaze. Many people who write about this call this the male gaze when we are looking at images of women. That this image is designed ideally to appeal to a certain kind of male who likes a certain kind of woman, and that's why you see these images. Representations of images and narratives are sometimes what we use to determine what is true. So some people will argue that normativity is a product of the power to produce images. So if you have the money to produce movies and the power to produce music and distribute it globally, the power to write books, the power to make maps, you can actually create the truth, especially if people start to accept your gaze as the normal way of viewing the world, even if they are not the ideal spectator or the ideal consumer of that work. Many images of Africa that depict Africa as the dark continent, or talk about Africa as a place without history, or as a place without civilization, or as a place without good government, have a long history that runs 500 years that we'll be talking about. And in that history, we notice that the production of these stories and narratives is oftentimes not coming from the people who might be considered African themselves. Yet these representations and narratives have been circulated within Africa itself for such a long time that some Africans accept it as true, and some might argue, using discourse analysis, that this is because they have accepted the gaze, some people would say, the Western gaze or European gaze as the norm. And this makes them see their own reality according to these representations and images. If you think about it, there aren't many books written, for instance, in many indigenous African languages that circulate globally. Those books have to be translated into global languages. Most of what we now call global languages are languages that are associated with colonial expansion. Languages like Spanish, languages like English, languages like French. These languages have global reach, and it is mostly in these languages that a lot of writing about the nature of the world is produced through images and narratives. This does not mean that everything that is produced in those languages is not true, but some people would argue that a lot of what those languages represent is a world that assumes the gaze of this person, who is the ideal looker and the ideal consumer of that information. They have a particular profile. Most likely, they're European in the tradition of, say, history writing that is taught in many parts of Africa, and they are also male, and they are often people who are middle class or upper class. They produce their world and circulate these images and narratives, and they can create normativity or objectivity using that system.